The rain fell in sheets against the window-panes of Ashworth Manor, each droplet racing down the glass like tears Clara wished she could shed. She stood in the drawing-room, her fingers trembling as they traced the edge of the letter that had arrived that morning. The Duke of Thornfield would be arriving within the fortnight to finalize their engagement. An engagement she had never wanted, to a man she had never loved, arranged by a father who saw her as nothing more than a valuable piece in his social climbing game. Clara Ashworth had always known this day would come. From the moment she turned 18, her father had made his intentions clear. The Ashworths were gentry, respectable but not titled, and Edmund Ashworth would stop at nothing to see his daughter married into the peerage. The Duke of Thornfield, a man of 42 to her 22 years, was the perfect candidate. Wealthy, influential, and recently widowed, he needed an heir and was willing to overlook the Ashworths' modest fortune in exchange for Clara's youth and breeding capabilities. She closed her eyes and tried to remember what the Duke looked like from their single meeting 3 years prior. All she could recall was a stern face, graying temples, and cold eyes that had assessed her as one might assess a broodmare. He had not been cruel, but neither had he been kind. He had simply been indifferent, which somehow felt worse than either extreme. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made Clara quickly fold the letter and tuck it into her sleeve. Her younger sister, Beatrice, burst into the room with her characteristic lack of propriety, her cheeks flushed from running. "Clara, you must come quickly. There's been an accident on the road near the estate. Papa has sent for the doctor, but the man they've brought into the servants' quarters is in a terrible state." Clara's heart quickened with concern. What sort of accident? His carriage overturned in the storm. The driver was killed instantly, they say, but the gentleman inside survived. He's unconscious and bleeding terribly. Mrs. Henderson is beside herself, not knowing what to do. Without hesitation, Clara gathered her skirts and followed her sister through the manor's corridors. Her mother would disapprove of her involving herself in such matters, but Clara had always possessed a practical nature and a steady hand in crisis. She had assisted the village doctor on several occasions, much to her mother's horror, and had even studied from medical texts borrowed from their local physician. The servants' quarters were in chaos when they arrived. Mrs. Henderson, their housekeeper, was directing maids to fetch water and linens while footmen stood uselessly about, uncertain how to help. On a narrow bed in one of the rooms lay a man, his fine clothes torn and muddied, his face covered in blood from a gash across his forehead. Clara moved to his side immediately, her training overriding any maidenly squeamishness. She began gently cleaning the wound, relieved to find it looked worse than it actually was. Head wounds bled profusely, but this one would not require more than careful stitching. As she worked, wiping away the blood and dirt, the man's features became clearer. He was young, perhaps no more than 30, with strong features and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. Even unconscious and injured, there was something arresting about him. His hands, which she examined for broken bones, were those of a gentleman but showed signs of actual use, calluses on the palms suggesting he was no idle aristocrat. "Beatrice, fetch my sewing kit from my chambers," Clara instructed. "Mrs. Henderson, we'll need laudanum when the doctor arrives, but for now, continue with clean water and bandages." As she worked to undress the stranger enough to check for further injuries, her fingers found a leather wallet in his coat pocket. She hesitated, then withdrew it, hoping to find some identification. Inside were several calling cards and a letter addressed to a Mr. James Marlowe of London. Mr. Marlowe, she learned from the letter she probably shouldn't have read, was a second son who had made his fortune in trade, a fact that would make him unacceptable in many drawing-rooms despite his wealth. He had been traveling to visit a friend in the countryside when the accident occurred. Over the next 3 hours, Clara worked alongside Dr. Weatherby to tend to Mr. Marlowe's injuries. Beyond the head wound, he had 3 cracked ribs, a badly sprained ankle, and numerous bruises and lacerations. The doctor praised Clara's initial care and predicted a full recovery, provided the patient rested for several weeks. "He cannot be moved," Dr. Weatherby declared. "Not for at least a fortnight, possibly longer. The risk of inflammation or fever is too great." Clara's father was summoned, and she watched his face cycle through annoyance, calculation, and finally resignation. They could hardly turn an injured gentleman out into the storm, and as the accident had occurred on their land, they bore some responsibility for his care. "Very well," Edmund Ashworth declared. "He may remain in the guest wing until he is well enough to travel. But I expect him to be discreet and unobtrusive. We have important matters to attend to in the coming weeks, and I'll not have our household disrupted by some unfortunate tradesman." Clara felt a flash of anger at her father's callousness, but held her tongue. At least Mr. Marlowe would have proper care. For the next 2 days, Clara found herself drawn to the guest wing more often than was strictly necessary. She told herself it was merely to ensure her patient received adequate care, but truthfully, she was curious about the stranger who had literally crashed into their lives. When he finally regained consciousness on the 3rd morning, she happened to be changing the bandage on his forehead. His eyes fluttered open, revealing irises of remarkable amber, like honey held up to sunlight. For a moment he stared at her in confusion, then winced as pain clearly reminded him of his injuries. "Please, don't try to move suddenly," Clara said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've been in an accident. You're at Ashworth Manor, and you're quite safe." "An accident," he repeated, his voice rough from disuse. "I remember. The wheel caught in a rut, and then—" He closed his eyes briefly. "My driver, Thomas. Is he?" "I'm so sorry," Clara said softly. "He didn't survive." Grief flickered across Mr. Marlowe's face, genuine and deep. "He had a wife and 3 children. I must make arrangements for them." The fact that his first conscious thoughts were for his servant's family told Clara much about his character. "We will help you with that, I promise. But first, you must focus on healing. You have cracked ribs, a sprained ankle, and a rather nasty head wound. Dr. Weatherby says you must rest for at least 2 weeks before attempting to travel." 2 weeks? He looked distressed. "But I have business matters in London, and my friend—" "Your friend can wait, and so can your business," Clara said firmly. "Would you rather risk fever and permanent injury? Or worse?" A hint of a smile touched his lips despite his obvious pain. "You have a formidable bedside manner, miss." "Ashworth. Clara Ashworth. This is my father's estate. James Marlowe, at your service. Or I would be, if I could manage to stand without feeling as though I've been trampled by horses." He paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her self-conscious. "You've been caring for me, haven't you? I have vague memories of an angel with a cool cloth and gentle hands." Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Hardly an angel, Mr. Marlowe. Simply a woman with some practical medical knowledge and a steady stomach. My mother would be appalled if she knew the extent of my involvement in your care." "Then your mother has more concern for propriety than gratitude. You saved my life, Miss Ashworth. Dr. Weatherby saved your life. I merely kept you comfortable until he arrived." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Clara's mother, Lady Margaret Ashworth, whose expression of tight-lipped disapproval suggested she had been searching for her daughter and was displeased to find her in a gentleman's bedchamber, even an invalid's. "Clara, this is most improper. Mrs. Henderson can see to Mr. Marlowe's needs. You are required in the morning-room. Your father has received word that the Duke of Thornfield will be arriving tomorrow, earlier than expected." Clara's stomach dropped. Tomorrow. She had hoped for more time, though she couldn't say why. More time would not change anything. She would still have to marry the Duke, would still have to leave her home and everything familiar to become the wife of a man who inspired in her nothing but cold dread. "Of course, mother," she said, rising from the bedside. She didn't look at Mr. Marlowe, couldn't bear to, though she felt his curious gaze upon her. That evening, Clara endured a lengthy lecture from her mother about proper behavior and the importance of the Duke's visit. Her trousseau was discussed, the wedding date suggested, the future heirs anticipated. Clara felt as though she were observing the conversation from a great distance, as if it concerned someone else entirely. The Duke of Thornfield arrived the following afternoon in a magnificent carriage with his coat of arms emblazoned on the door. Clara watched from the window as he descended, noting his rigid posture and imperious expression. He looked older than she remembered, his face deeply lined, though perhaps that was merely the harsh afternoon light. The formal introduction in the drawing-room was everything Clara had feared. The Duke barely looked at her as he discussed the marriage settlement with her father, occasionally directing a question to her mother about Clara's accomplishments and education. When he finally did address Clara directly, it was to ask if she played the pianoforte adequately and whether she was prepared to manage a large household and entertain extensively. "I am prepared to do my duty, Your Grace," Clara replied, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Good. I require a wife who understands her obligations. My first wife, God rest her soul, was prone to emotional displays and fits of melancholy. I trust you are of sturdier constitution." Clara wanted to say that perhaps his first wife had been melancholy because she was married to him, but she bit her tongue and simply nodded. The Duke stayed for 3 days, during which Clara felt increasingly suffocated. He laid out his expectations with all the warmth of a military commander issuing orders. She would move to Thornfield Hall immediately after the wedding. She would cut ties with any unsuitable friends. She would produce an heir within the first 2 years of marriage. She would never embarrass him in society. The only respite Clara found was in her stolen visits to Mr. Marlowe's room. He was recovering well, able to sit up now and take short walks around his chamber with a cane. More importantly, he was intelligent, well-read, and possessed a dry wit that made her laugh for the first time in days. "You seem troubled, Miss Ashworth," he observed during one visit, after she had been unusually quiet. "Merely tired," she lied. "I don't believe you. You've been looking as though you're marching toward your own execution these past few days. Is it the Duke? I've heard the servants talking, you know. They say you're to marry him." Clara's hands stilled in their task of arranging his medicine bottles. "Servants gossip. But in this case they're telling the truth, aren't they?" His voice was gentle but persistent. "You don't wish to marry him." "What I wish is irrelevant," Clara said, more sharply than she intended. "I am my father's daughter, and I will do my duty to my family." "Even if it makes you miserable?" "Many marriages are not love matches, Mr. Marlowe. Mine will be no different from thousands of others." "That doesn't make it right." Clara turned to face him, surprised by the passion in his voice. "What would you have me do? Defy my father and bring shame upon my family? I have no fortune of my own, no way to support myself. This is the life that has been chosen for me. You could choose differently." "How?" "How exactly could I choose differently?" The frustration she had been suppressing for months suddenly burst forth. "Should I run away to London and become a governess? A seamstress? Live in some rented room on the charity of distant relatives who would hold every morsel of food I ate over my head as proof of their generosity? You're a man, Mr. Marlowe. You cannot possibly understand the cage that society builds around women." He was quiet for a long moment, his amber eyes studying her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "You're right," he said finally. "I cannot fully understand. But I know what it is to be trapped by circumstances beyond my control, to feel as though your life is being lived according to someone else's script." Something in his tone made Clara sit down in the chair beside his bed. "Tell me." And he did. James Marlowe, she learned, was indeed a second son, but he had also been a disappointment to his family from birth. His older brother was everything their father valued: athletic, charming, interested in hunting and politics. James preferred books and business, mathematics and innovation. When his father died, his brother inherited everything, and James was essentially turned out with a modest allowance and the expectation that he would marry appropriately and live quietly. Instead, he had invested his allowance in a shipping venture that his family considered beneath him. That venture had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, and James had built a small empire through shrewd investments and hard work. But no amount of wealth could erase the stain of trade in his family's eyes. His brother refused to receive him. His mother wrote occasionally but would not be seen with him in public. He was wealthy but socially unacceptable, welcomed for his money but scorned for how he obtained it. "So you see," James concluded, "I do understand something of being trapped. Though I admit I was able to buy my way to a kind of freedom that you, as a woman, cannot access." "At least you had the opportunity to try," Clara said. "I'm not even permitted that." They sat in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, James spoke again, his voice careful. "What if there was another way? Not running away or bringing shame to your family, but simply choosing a different path." "What do you mean?" "You need to marry to satisfy your family's expectations and secure your future. I need a wife to gain social respectability and acceptance." "What if we married instead?" Clara stared at him, certain she had misheard. "I beg your pardon?" "Marry me, Miss Ashworth. I know it seems sudden, and I know I'm not a duke, but I can offer you freedom. Real freedom. I'm wealthy enough that you would want for nothing, and I have no interest in controlling you or forcing you into some rigid mold of wifely behavior. You could pursue your interests, your medical studies, if you wished. You could have your own life." "You're delirious," Clara said, standing abruptly. "The fever must have returned." "I'm perfectly lucid." James struggled to sit up straighter, wincing at the pain in his ribs. "Think about it rationally. Your father wants you to marry for advantage. I can offer financial security and freedom from want. My wealth might not come with a title, but it's substantial. As for me, I gain social credibility through marriage to a respectable family. We would both benefit. But you don't. We barely know each other." "We know each other better than you know the Duke of Thornfield," James pointed out. "And I'm offering you partnership, not ownership. Miss Ashworth, Clara, I saw your face when the Duke was here. You looked like a prisoner watching the gallows being built. I'm offering you an alternative." Clara's mind whirled. It was madness. Complete madness. And yet, "My father would never agree. You're a man of trade. He wants a title for me." "Your father wants security and social advancement for his family. I can provide the former abundantly and, with time and the right connections, possibly even the latter. Let me speak with him. He'll refuse. Perhaps. But what if he doesn't? Don't you owe it to yourself to at least try?" Clara looked at this man she had known for less than a week, this stranger who was offering her a life raft when she was drowning. It was impulsive and impractical and exactly the kind of thing she had never allowed herself to do. But for the first time in months, she felt something other than dread when thinking about her future. "Very well," she said quietly. "Speak with my father. But I make no promises." The conversation between James Marlowe and Edmund Ashworth took place the following morning and lasted nearly 2 hours. Clara paced in the music-room, unable to focus on anything, while Beatrice peppered her with questions she couldn't answer. When her father finally summoned her to his study, his expression was unreadable. James sat in a chair by the window, looking pale but determined. "Mr. Marlowe has made me an extraordinary proposition," her father began without preamble. "He wishes to marry you, Clara." He's offered a marriage settlement that is, I must admit, generous to a fault. More generous than even the Duke's terms. Clara's heart pounded. And what is your answer, father? Edmund Ashworth leaned back in his chair, studying his daughter. I confess I am torn. The Duke of Thornfield would give us the social elevation I desire. But Mr. Marlowe offers something the Duke cannot, genuine affection for you and financial security that even a duke might envy. I've made inquiries about his business affairs. The man is extraordinarily wealthy. But he has no title, Clara said, hardly daring to hope. No, he doesn't. However, he has suggested that with the right investments and connections, a baronetcy might not be out of reach within a few years. It's not a dukedom, but— He paused, seeming to wrestle with himself. Your mother will be disappointed, and I'll have to face the Duke's anger at the broken engagement. But, Clara, I am not so cold a father that I cannot see you've been miserable. If this is what you truly want, I will not stand in your way. Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. Father, However, he continued sternly, you must be certain. Once we break with the Duke, there is no going back. If this marriage to Mr. Marlowe should prove unhappy, you cannot change your mind. Do you understand? Clara looked at James, who met her gaze steadily. In his eyes she saw not ownership or expectation, but possibility. A chance at something different, something better. I understand, she said. And yes, this is what I want. The breaking of the engagement to the Duke of Thornfield was every bit as unpleasant as Clara had anticipated. The Duke was furious at what he considered a grave insult, and he made certain that everyone in their social circle knew the Ashworth girl had thrown him over for a tradesman. Clara's mother took to her bed for 3 days with a sick headache, mourning the loss of a ducal son-in-law. But Clara found she didn't care. For the first time in her life she had made a choice for herself, and the freedom of that choice was intoxicating. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, a quiet affair at the local church with only family and close friends in attendance. James had recovered from his injuries and stood tall beside her at the altar, his amber eyes warm with something that might have been affection or might have simply been gratitude. Clara wasn't sure, and for the moment she didn't need to be. They settled into James's London townhouse, a beautiful Georgian building in a respectable neighborhood. True to his word, James gave Clara freedom she had never imagined possible. He encouraged her studies, introducing her to physicians and scholars who took her questions seriously. He made no demands on her time or attention, treating her more as a beloved sister than a wife. It should have been perfect. And yet, as weeks turned into months, Clara found herself increasingly unsettled. James was kind, considerate, intellectually stimulating. They had dinner together most evenings, discussing everything from politics to literature to medical advances. He made her laugh. He valued her opinions. He was, in every way, the opposite of what the Duke would have been. So why did she feel this growing ache in her chest whenever he bid her good night at her chamber door? Why did her heart race when his hand accidentally brushed hers over breakfast? Why did she find herself disappointed when business called him away for days at a time? It was Beatrice, visiting for a few weeks, who finally forced Clara to confront the truth. They were taking tea in the drawing-room when her sister suddenly set down her cup and fixed Clara with a knowing look. "You're in love with him," Beatrice announced. Clara nearly choked on her tea. "I beg your pardon? Your husband. You're in love with James. It's written all over your face whenever you look at him. Don't be ridiculous. Ours is a marriage of convenience. We have an understanding." "An understanding that's making you miserable," Beatrice observed. "Clara, I've watched you this past week. You light up when he enters a room. You laugh at all his jokes, even the terrible ones. You've mentioned him in nearly every conversation we've had. And unless I'm very much mistaken, You've been sleeping poorly and picking at your food." Clara opened her mouth to deny it, then closed it again. Was Beatrice right? She thought back over the past months, to all the small moments that had accumulated without her realizing. The way her day felt incomplete if she didn't see James at breakfast. The pleasure she took in selecting books she thought he would enjoy. The way her breath caught when he smiled at her in that particular way that suggested she had said something clever. Oh God! She was in love with her husband. "It doesn't matter," Clara said quietly. "James married me for social advantage, nothing more. He's been a wonderful friend, but that's all he wants from me. All he'll ever want." "Have you asked him?" "Of course not. Beatrice, I cannot simply declare my feelings when they were never part of our agreement. It would make things unbearably awkward between us." "Or," Beatrice suggested gently, "it might make things wonderful. Clara, has it occurred to you that James might have developed feelings for you as well? I've seen the way he looks at you when he thinks you're not paying attention. That's not the look of a man regarding a convenient arrangement." Clara wanted desperately to believe her sister, but fear held her back. She had taken one enormous risk in marrying James. The thought of taking another, of exposing her heart so completely, terrified her. What if she was wrong? What if she declared her love and saw pity or discomfort in his eyes? She couldn't bear to lose even his friendship. The crisis came on an evening in late autumn. James had been away for nearly a week on business, and Clara had felt his absence like a physical ache. When he finally returned, she was in the library, supposedly reading but actually watching the clock and listening for the sound of his arrival. He found her there, windswept and slightly damp from the rain, and the smile that lit his face when he saw her made Clara's heart stutter. "I've missed you," he said simply, and then seemed surprised by his own admission. "I've missed you too," Clara replied, setting aside her book. James crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite hers, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. The fire crackled in the hearth. Rain pattered against the windows, and something unspoken stretched between them, taut as a violin string. "Clara," James began, then stopped. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had learned meant he was struggling to find words. "I need to tell you something. I've been rehearsing this speech for the entire journey home, but now that I'm here, I find myself at a loss." Clara's pulse quickened. "What is it?" "I want to renegotiate the terms of our marriage." Her stomach dropped. Of course. He wanted to end their arrangement, to set her aside now that he had gained sufficient social standing. She had been foolish to think. "I want a real marriage," James continued, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Not an arrangement of convenience, but a true partnership. Clara, these past months with you have been the happiest of my life. You are brilliant and brave and wonderfully peculiar, and I find that I am utterly, completely in love with you. I know that's not what we agreed to. I know I'm breaking the terms of our understanding. But I cannot continue living under the same roof with you, seeing you every day, and not tell you how I feel." Clara stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. "You love me?" "Desperately," James said, and there was such naked honesty in his face that Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. "I think I began falling in love with you when you were so fierce about my care, ordering everyone about and refusing to let me feel sorry for myself. Every day since has only made it worse, or better, I suppose, depending on one's perspective. I love your curiosity and your kindness. I love how you wrinkle your nose when you're concentrating. I love your terrible singing voice and your complete inability to tell a subtle lie. I love everything about you, and if you cannot return those feelings, I understand. We can continue as we have been. But I needed you to know the truth." Clara discovered she was crying, tears streaming down her face as she laughed and sobbed at the same time. "You ridiculous man! You wonderful, ridiculous man! I love you too. I've been in love with you for months, but I was so afraid to say anything." "You love me?" James repeated, as if he couldn't quite believe it. "Yes, you impossible person. I love you." James was out of his chair in an instant, kneeling before her and taking her hands in his. "Clara Marlowe, would you do me the very great honor of truly marrying me? Of being not just my wife in name, but my partner in all things? My lover and my dearest friend?" "Yes," Clara said through her tears. "Yes, yes, yes." When he kissed her, it was nothing like Clara had imagined a kiss might be. It was better, warmer, sweeter, filled with promise and possibility. She wound her arms around his neck and kissed him back with all the love and longing she had been suppressing for months. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and laughing, James rested his forehead against hers. "I have a confession," he said. "Another one?" "I didn't just happen to be traveling past your estate that day. I was coming to see you." Clara pulled back to look at him. "What do you mean?" "After my accident, I was unconscious for some time, but I was also partially aware. I remember hearing your voice before I truly woke, remember the gentleness of your touch. And later, when I was conscious but still very ill, I heard you talking to your sister about the Duke of Thornfield. I heard the despair in your voice, and I thought perhaps I could help. Perhaps we could help each other." "So you were planning the proposal even before you were fully recovered?" "Is that very terrible of me? I know I claimed it was a spontaneous idea, but truthfully, I had been thinking about it almost from the moment I understood your situation. I told myself it was a practical arrangement, that I was simply solving a problem for both of us. But I think, even then, I was already half in love with you." Clara laughed, shaking her head in wonder. "We're both terrible liars, apparently." "Thank goodness for that," James said, pulling her close again. "I should hate to be married to someone skilled at deception." They talked late into the night, sharing all the small moments of realization when friendship had begun to transform into love. James confessed how difficult it had been to maintain a respectful distance, how many times he had stopped himself from reaching for her hand or stealing a kiss. Clara admitted to her jealousy when other women paid him attention at social events, to the way she had begun selecting her dresses based on which colors he had once complimented. "We've wasted so much time," Clara said, curled against his chest on the sofa, the fire burning low. "No," James disagreed gently. "We've built a foundation. We became friends first, and now we'll build everything else upon that friendship. I wouldn't change a moment of it." In the weeks that followed, Clara discovered that being truly married to James was even better than the arrangement they had shared before. He was an attentive and passionate lover, but also a thoughtful partner who continued to encourage her interests and aspirations. They traveled together to medical lectures, visited hospitals where Clara could observe new techniques, and hosted dinners that brought together the most interesting minds in London, regardless of their social standing. The expected baronetcy came through within 2 years, as James's business success and charitable work finally won him the social acceptance he had been denied. But by then, Clara had realized that titles meant nothing compared to the life they had built together. She would rather be Mrs. Marlowe married to James than a duchess married to a man she didn't love. Sometimes, late at night, Clara thought about that rainy day when James's carriage had overturned near their estate. She thought about how close she had come to a life of cold duty and misery with the Duke of Thornfield. She thought about fate and chance and the strange paths that led people to their destinies. "Do you believe in divine providence?" she asked James one evening as they sat together in their library. "I believe that we make our own luck," James replied, setting aside his book. "But I also believe that sometimes, very rarely, the universe conspires to put us exactly where we need to be." "Why do you ask?" "I was just thinking about the accident. About how different my life would be if you hadn't taken that road, if your wheel hadn't caught in that rut. James pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I like to think that we would have found each other anyway, somehow. Perhaps you would have come to London and we would have met at some terribly dull party. Or perhaps I would have attended one of those medical lectures you're always dragging me to, and we would have disagreed about something obscure and fascinating. You think we were meant to find each other? I think that once I knew you existed, nothing could have kept me away. The accident simply accelerated the inevitable." Clara smiled against his shoulder. "That's very romantic for a practical businessman." "Well, you've had a terrible influence on me. I used to be completely rational, and now I find myself writing love poems and mooning about like a schoolboy whenever you're away." "Love poems? James Marlowe, are you telling me you've been writing poetry?" "Certainly not. And if anyone suggests otherwise, I will deny it vehemently." "I want to read them." "Absolutely not. They're terrible. I burn them immediately after writing them." "Liar! You save them, don't you?" His guilty silence was answer enough, and Clara laughed with pure delight. She had been promised to a duke she had never loved, destined for a life of elegant unhappiness. Instead, through a combination of chance and choice, courage and luck, she had found something infinitely more valuable, a marriage built on love and respect, passion and friendship. She had found James, and he had found her, and together they had created a life that defied society's expectations and fulfilled their own heart's desires. On a spring morning several years later, Clara stood at the window of their London townhouse, watching the street below while absently resting a hand on her swollen belly. Their first child would arrive within the month, and she felt a complex mixture of anticipation and fear that James helped her navigate with his characteristic patience and humor. "Second thoughts?" James asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her, his hands covering hers on her belly. "Never," Clara said firmly. "I was just thinking about how grateful I am. For the accident that wasn't an accident. For your terrible proposal from your sickbed. For your courage in speaking the truth of your feelings. For all of it." "I'm the grateful one," James insisted. "You took an enormous risk on a man you barely knew. You defied your family's expectations and society's rules. You were brave when I was still finding my courage." "We were brave together," Clara corrected. "And we still are." Their daughter was born 3 weeks later, arriving in the early hours of a May morning with a lusty cry that announced her arrival to the entire household. Clara, exhausted but exhilarated, watched James hold their child for the first time and saw tears stream down his face. "She's perfect," he whispered. "You're both perfect." They named her Margaret, after Clara's mother, who had eventually forgiven her daughter for the scandal of rejecting a duke and had become one of James's most ardent supporters. But they called her Meg, a sensible name for what they hoped would be a sensible girl. As Clara recovered from the birth, she often reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought of the girl she had been, standing at the window of Ashworth Manor, dreading the arrival of the Duke. She thought of the woman she had become, confident in her choices and secure in love. Life, she had learned, was not always what one expected or what others planned. Sometimes it was better. Sometimes a terrible accident was actually Providence in disguise. Sometimes a marriage of convenience became the greatest love story one could imagine. Sometimes the most impulsive decision turned out to be the wisest choice one ever made. As she watched James rock their daughter to sleep, humming some tuneless lullaby, Clara smiled. She had been promised to a duke she had never loved, but she had married a man she would love forever. And in making that choice, in taking that leap of faith, she had found not just happiness but freedom, the freedom to be herself, to love fully, to live boldly. It was more than she had ever dared to dream possible, and every single day she was grateful for the courage they had both shown in choosing a different path. The path that led not to duty and cold resignation, but to love and warmth and a future filled with infinite possibility. Sometimes, Clara told Meg years later when her daughter was old enough to understand, the greatest adventure begins not with a grand plan, but with a simple choice to believe in something better. To believe in love. To believe in oneself. The years continued to unfold with their mixture of joy and challenge. James's businesses flourished, allowing them to split their time between London and a country estate they purchased in Surrey. It was smaller than Ashworth Manor, but infinitely more to Clara's taste, a comfortable manor house with extensive gardens and enough land for the children to roam freely. Yes, children. Meg was joined by a brother, Thomas, named for the driver who had died in the accident that changed everything. Then came another daughter, Beatrice, named for Clara's sister who had been the first to recognize the love blooming between husband and wife. The house was full of noise and laughter, of muddy boots in the hallway and books scattered across every surface. Clara established a small clinic on their Surrey property, where she treated tenant farmers and village residents who couldn't afford London physicians. James supported her endeavors wholeheartedly, even enduring the raised eyebrows and whispered comments of their more conservative neighbors. Let them talk, he always said. Clara was helping people, and that mattered more than any amount of social disapproval. Edmund Ashworth, Clara's father, eventually admitted that James had been the right choice after all. The Duke of Thornfield, they learned through society gossip, had married a young heiress within 6 months of Clara's rejection and made her thoroughly miserable before dying of apoplexy 3 years later. His widow had promptly left England for the continent and never returned. "You saved me from that," Clara told James one evening, years into their marriage, as they walked through their gardens in the golden light of sunset. "You saved yourself," James corrected, as he always did when she credited him with her rescue. "You made the choice. I simply offered an alternative." "We saved each other then," Clara amended. "I think that's how the best marriages work. Not one person rescuing the other, but two people choosing to build something together." James stopped walking and turned to face her, his amber eyes reflecting the dying sun. Age had added lines around his eyes and silver threads through his dark hair, but to Clara he was more handsome now than he had been as a younger man. Character and kindness had refined his features, and the love in his gaze never wavered. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like?" he asked. "If you had married the Duke, I mean. Do you ever think about that path not taken?" "Never," Clara said honestly. "Or rather, I think about it only to be grateful I didn't take it. Every difficult moment we've faced together, every challenge, every loss, I would choose them all again, because they came with you. I would choose you, always, over the easiest or most prestigious path. You taught me that love is worth more than any title." "You taught me that I was worth loving," James replied softly. "I spent so much of my early life believing that my worth was measured in guineas and social standing. You showed me that character matters more than pedigree, and that kindness is its own form of nobility." They kissed there in the garden, with the roses blooming around them and the distant sound of their children playing on the lawn. It was not their first kiss, nor their 1000th, but it held the same sweetness as that initial kiss years ago in the library, when they had finally confessed their love. Later that evening, when the children were in bed and they sat together in James's study, Clara writing correspondence and James reviewing business accounts, she looked up and caught him watching her with a small smile. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking about wheels and ruts," he said mysteriously. "I beg your pardon?" "The wheel of my carriage, catching in that rut on the road near your family's estate. Such a small thing, really. A moment of inattention from poor Thomas, a depression in the muddy road. But that tiny incident changed the entire course of both our lives." "Do you believe in fate, then?" James considered the question carefully. "I believe in choices. I chose to take that road. You chose to nurse a stranger back to health. We both chose to be honest about what we wanted, even when it was frightening. Fate may have brought us to the same place, but we decided what happened next." "Philosophy from a businessman?" Clara teased. "I contain multitudes," James replied with exaggerated dignity. "Besides, marrying you forced me to become more introspective. You're always asking these profound questions. Someone has to add depth to this household." James threw a wadded piece of paper at her, which she dodged with practiced ease, laughing. Their relationship had always contained this element of playfulness, even in the early days when they were navigating from friendship toward love. It was part of what made their marriage work. They genuinely liked each other, enjoyed each other's company, could be themselves without pretense or performance. On Meg's 18th birthday, Clara watched her daughter dance at her debut ball and felt the strange circularity of time. She had been 18 when her own father had begun planning to marry her off to the Duke. But Meg, Clara was determined, would have choices her mother had not been offered. "You don't have to marry anyone you don't wish to marry," Clara told her daughter that evening. "Your father and I have set aside funds for you. If you want to remain unmarried, if you want to travel, if you want to study, whatever you choose, we will support you." Meg hugged her mother tightly. "I know, Mama. You've told me this since I was old enough to understand. But I think I should like to marry someday. If I can find what you and Papa have." "And if you can't?" Clara asked gently. "Then I won't marry at all. I would rather be a happy spinster than an unhappy wife." Clara smiled, proud of the confident young woman her daughter had become. "That's my girl." Meg did eventually marry, at 23, to a kind physician she met through Clara's clinic work. Thomas became a ship's surgeon, combining his mother's medical interests with his father's love of trade and travel. Young Beatrice showed signs of wanting to follow her mother into medicine, though she had to fight even harder than Clara had for acceptance in that field. James and Clara supported all their children's choices, providing them with the freedom and opportunities they themselves had fought to create. They broke with convention when necessary and stood firm in the face of criticism. Their marriage had been unconventional from the start. Why should their parenting be any different? As Clara entered her middle years, she found herself increasingly sought after for advice by younger women trapped in situations similar to what hers had been. She became known, quietly, as someone who could help arrange alternatives, introducing young women to respectable men of trade who might value partnership over subjugation, helping facilitate elopements when necessary, providing funds for those who wished to establish independence. James supported these efforts, understanding that Clara was paying forward the salvation she had received. They had been fortunate, they both knew. Not everyone's convenient marriage turned into a love match. Not every woman found a man willing to offer true partnership. But where they could help, they did. On their 25th wedding anniversary, James surprised Clara with a trip back to Ashworth Manor, which her brother now managed after their father's death. They walked the grounds where they had first met, visited the room where James had recovered from his injuries, stood in the drawing-room where Clara had once stared out at the rain and dreaded her future. "I was so afraid that day," Clara confessed, standing at that same window. "The day the Duke's letter arrived. I felt as though my life was ending before it had truly begun." "And now?" James asked, slipping his arm around her waist. "Now I know that it was actually beginning. The real beginning, not the false one my father had planned. Everything before that moment was preparation. My real life started with a carriage accident and a stranger with amber eyes." "A handsome stranger, surely?" James prompted. "A tolerable stranger," Clara corrected with a smile, "who became handsome through familiarity and affection." "Tolerable! The woman wounds me still, after 25 years. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the same view Clara had watched all those years ago. But now she saw it with different eyes, not as a cage, but as a beginning. This was where her story had started to change. This was where she had first chosen courage over compliance. "Thank you," Clara said suddenly. "For what?" "For giving me a choice. For offering an alternative when I thought I had none. For loving me, even when it wasn't part of our arrangement." James turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Clara Marlowe, you are the best decision I ever made, the bravest thing I ever did, the greatest adventure of my life. If I could go back and do it all again, the only thing I would change is that I would tell you I loved you sooner." "We had to become friends first," Clara reminded him. "We had to learn to trust each other. The love that grew from that friendship is stronger than any instant passion could have been, ever the rational one." "Someone has to be," Clara said, echoing their old pattern of teasing. Then, more seriously, she added, "I love you, James Marlowe. I have loved you for 25 years, and I will love you for 25 more, and beyond that if we're granted the time." They kissed there in the drawing-room of Ashworth Manor, the same house where Clara had once felt so trapped. But she wasn't trapped anymore, hadn't been for decades. She was free, free to love, free to choose, free to be herself. And that freedom, that love, had been worth every risk, every moment of fear, every unconventional choice. As they prepared to leave Ashworth Manor and return to their own home, Clara took one last look at the room where she had nursed James back to health. So much had begun there: friendship, partnership, love, family. A simple act of kindness toward an injured stranger had changed the trajectory of her entire life. She thought about the young woman she had been, convinced that duty meant sacrificing happiness. She thought about the Duke of Thornfield and the cold, empty life she had almost accepted. She thought about the courage it had taken to say yes to James's unexpected proposal, to choose possibility over certainty. And she thought about all the young women still facing similar choices, still believing they had no alternative but to accept what was offered, to submit to arrangements made by others. Her story, she hoped, might give them courage, might show them that alternatives existed if one was brave enough to seek them. "Ready?" James asked, offering his arm. "Always," Clara replied, taking it. They walked out of Ashworth Manor together, leaving behind the ghosts of who they might have been, carrying with them the reality of who they had chosen to become. Behind them lay duty and expectation, the weight of social convention and familial pressure. Ahead lay home and love, family and freedom, the life they had built together through choice and courage. Clara had been promised to a duke she had never loved, but she had married a man who had given her the greatest gift imaginable, the freedom to choose her own path, to follow her own heart, to become the woman she was meant to be. And in return, she had given him the same gift, accepting him not for his wealth or status but for his character, his mind, his heart. Theirs was not a fairy tale of love at first sight. It was something better, a story of two people who found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, who built friendship into love and convenience into commitment, who chose each other every single day for 25 years and would continue choosing each other for all the years to come. As their carriage pulled away from Ashworth Manor, Clara leaned her head on James's shoulder and smiled. The rain had been falling that long-ago day when everything changed. Today, the sun shone brilliantly, warming the countryside and illuminating the road ahead. It seemed appropriate somehow, this contrast between then and now, between the storm that had brought them together and the sunshine that blessed their continued journey. "What are you smiling about?" James asked, his own lips curved in answering amusement. "Everything," Clara said simply. "I'm smiling about everything." And it was true. She was smiling about the past that had led them here, the present they shared, and the future still unfolding before them. She was smiling about love found in unexpected places, about choices made in the face of fear, about the beautiful, messy, imperfect, perfect life they had created together. She had been promised to a duke, but she had chosen love. And that, Clara reflected as the carriage carried them home, had made all the difference.